Today we're back with DJ again, and today we were going to discuss some of the applications of studies in PubMed and how they apply to the bodybuilding community, the fitness community, and where people kind of go wrong. What's going on, DJ?
How are you doing?
Excellent.
I think we should probably start with what we're going to address, the misconceptions that we're going to address and kind of where those originated from. And then we can kind of pull from this study and go over the data and whether it does or does not pertain to these demographics in the bodybuilding community.
Cool. So we're looking at, there is a study on PubMed. It's about Anavar, Oxandrolone, that we discussed. And it seems to be where a lot of people get the weight loss stuff from Anavar misconstrued, right? So it's titled Oral Anabolic Steroid Treatment, but not parenteral androgen treatment decreases abdominal fat in obese older men. So
keywords.
Yeah, keywords. Yeah. So first off, the study is using 40 to 60-year-old obese men with low testosterone, still in range, but on the low end of the range. And that's the study group. So you can take it away with some of your thoughts on this.
Well, the first thing I want to disclose is when we do speak about Anavar, and I know you had briefly touched on that our last video as well, and that got a lot of traction. It's not necessarily just females that are searching out the use of Anavar for fat loss. I also think that, especially among the bodybuilding community, where we do understand the applications a little bit better than the average person, that people assume it's just women wanting to take it because of the androgenic profile. Whereas I would say the majority of my male clients that are receiving testosterone from a clinic have inquired about Anavar for fat loss phases. Most people think that if they want to achieve fat loss, Anavar is going to be the go-to. Of course, there's other perks, the fact that they view it as an oral, so they don't have to inject it, and it has its appeal and other capacities. But everybody thinks it's going to be the golden ticket to fat loss. And I think some of that is going to come from how it's being presented on social media, of course. And I think a lot of it comes from bits and pieces of information that leak out from the bodybuilding community specifically. People know that orals are typically implemented in that tail end of contest prep. We know why we're implementing them. We also know the dangers that they hold and some of the risks associated. But from an outside perspective, when you are your leanest and you are in a fat loss phase and you look your best, you're taking Anavar. Therefore, Anavar is for fat loss, according to the majority.
Cool. So a little background information about Anavar, just so anyone watching this that might not understand the basics. So it is an oral anabolic steroid. It's a DHT derivative. It was invented in 1962 by Searle. It's changed hands a number of times and changed names. As far as I know, it's now no longer FDA approved for hormone replacement therapy. The last I saw, Rick Collins posted something. I'm not sure where this stands. I know lots of clinics are still writing it. It is some of the interesting things. So it is considered to have lower toxicity than most of the other oral anabolic steroids. That doesn't mean it's not toxic. It causes both liver and kidney stress. It will definitely elevate your liver enzymes. It's obviously dose dependent like any other drug for both its effects and its side effects. And in a man, at least, a lot of times when men ask me about this, they're looking to do something without injecting anything, right? They want to run this solo. For a man needs a source of estrogen. So running Anavar solo for most men, unless you're an outlier, will generally cause more health problems than necessary, and not necessarily going to cause a great outcome to run Anavar solo. So contrary to popular belief, the new rating system that we use is we designate things either class 1 or class 2 anabolic steroids. Class 1 binds to the androgen receptor, and class 2 are things that do not. And they're also defined by their effects. So Anavar technically is considered a class 1 because of its effects, although in vivo, it actually has pretty poor binding to the androgen receptor. This is partly defined by their effects. If you stack a class 1 with another class 1, like if you combine testosterone, has mixed activity. Testosterone is both class 1 and class 2. If you combine two class 1 drugs like Masteron and Anavar, the effects are additive, not magnified. If you combine a class 1 and a class 2 like Dianabol and Trenbolone, Dianabol being class 2 and trenbolone being class 1, the effects are synergistic, they're magnified. So that's kind of why the classes are important. But going back to Anavar, it's an oral steroid, it's super popular. Women also tend to think it's safe, which it can be, but the dose is much slower than you would think. I would say virilization can occur, somewhere between 5 and 15 milligrams. I would be very hesitant with using anything larger than that because it can cause serious long-lasting effects on people. What's your experience with that with females?
I would say anything over at 10, you're definitely going to be at higher risk in terms of virilization. I think the biggest issue that women face versus the male counterparts is going to be duration. If you look at the average time span that a male can utilize Anavar, and especially if they have supportive supplements in place without some of those negative side effects, it's going to be significantly longer. Duration is going to be one of the biggest factors in females for use of any compounds. Even if you do get more aggressive with dosage, it's the duration that's really key, and that's something I think we'll probably dive into in another video. Is the application of maybe using like a troche pre-workout. That's something Todd and I've discussed as well, versus what has actually been studied previously.
Yep. Yeah, and I touched on that on Instagram, and you and I talked about that with the it applies to men and women, but I think more importantly in women, when there's a threshold with dosing, right? When you cross that threshold, there's just side effects, and you just really want to stay under that. You can get much better results longer term if you kind of keep the dose at a more moderate dose for women.
I think I'm a really good example of that, honestly. When we say like, hey, the HPO axis is going to be very unique to the individual, people are going to respond to these drugs differently. You do have to take it on as a case by case scenario, because someone like me, I can't take any androgenic compounds at all. So most women realistically would be able to tolerate 10 milligrams of Anavar 6 to 8 weeks without any issues in terms of virilization. That would send me over the edge. I would not look or sound like I do right now. And that would probably, at the 5 milligram mark would probably impact me.
Yeah. That's a lot. Now, and something we touched on in our last video where we mentioned Anavar, and I think kind of this will kind of go back to the study, is people select Anavar specifically for weight loss, right? This seems to be the drug of choice for men and women, especially people that are new at this game that want to administer something to aid in fat loss. And they always want to use Anavar. And what I've noticed, especially in women, is the scale then goes up and they freak out, right? But we have to go back. This study is misleading. What people have to understand is it's an anabolic steroid, and it's used medically to gain weight, to stop weight loss from burns, from cancer, from anemia, chronic kidney failure, those sorts of things. It was never designed to be used for fat loss, right? So all androgens to some extent will aid in fat loss through a bunch of different mechanisms. But that being said, it's not taking Anavar alone is not necessarily going to cause fat loss, right? Diet is going to be the most important thing. And there are other chemicals that could be leveraged that are actually designed for fat loss that we don't necessarily need to get into in this video, but those would be more beneficial, I would think, in a situation like that versus something like Anavar. You and I would usually leverage Anavar for someone in a cutting phase because it's going to help them hold on to more muscle. Generally,
Yes.
why it would be used. Or for females specifically, females respond about 8 to 10 times as strongly to anabolics as men do. It can be used in the off season for a female to support growth. But in a man, it's actually on a milligram basis, Anavar is not weak at all, contrary to popular belief. It's just that to use a dose that would be effective for a man to grow would not be worth the liver stress or the kidney stress, at least in my mind. I think that there's better choices without destroying your health to get the same growth, because it will. Another misconception is most anabolic steroids are equal on a milligram basis and will cause about the same amount of nitrogen retention and growth.
Yes.
People tend to judge side effects assuming that that's an actual positive effect, where things like Primo and Anavar get overlooked because they don't really have a lot of visible side effects or mental side effects. So, but the actual muscle growth accrual is about the same. There's just no water retention. But so going back to the study, so you can start with the questions about it if you want.
Okay, so in this particular study, and hopefully we'll be able to get this on screen, they administered testosterone. and
Placebo.
Oxandrolone, and
There was a placebo group
they
initially.
did placebo, and the nandrolone came. But that's another thing that before we go into this, they did start this study out with the use of Anavar. That is what it was initially utilized, but they did make a switch 30 or 3 months into the study because of the negative impact that it had on the lipid profile. And that is something that we are pretty aware of, which, in certain use or certain applications, we are actively doing things to help mitigate those effects, and we are taking supportive supplements for that. But they actually switched 90 days in. So this isn't exactly long-term data that we have on the Anavar for use either before they switched. I think the biggest thing that people are taking away from this particular study, without diving into the specifics yet, is that when they did administer the Anavar, there was a reduction in subcutaneous fat. And that's where people say you take Anavar, you're going to lose fat. It's been shown in studies to produce fat loss. I want to get on Anavar because I want to lose fat, and this is what they're going to cite. But again, even in the title of the study, there's a lot of things here that are going to indicate that it's not necessarily going to transfer over to the use that we are, seeing it being pushed out on people for. Then when they finally made that switch, there was an immediate increase in visceral fat, but there was a continued reduction in the subcutaneous fats. And it did end up reversing some of the negative effects, especially on the blood lipids that they saw with the Oxandrolone administration.
Yep. Yeah. So the study started out, and there were 3 groups, right? There was a placebo group, there was a testosterone enanthate group, and there was an oxandrolone group, right? And the dosing, some of where it gets misconstrued is in the dosing strategy. So the testosterone enanthate group and the placebo group was given a fake injection, and the testosterone enanthate group was given 1 injection every 2 weeks. So if you understand anything about half-lives, pharmacokinetics, giving a testosterone enanthate injection every 2 weeks is really not very efficient or great practice, as you're going to get huge, peaks and valleys. So that could have contributed to some of the lack of results, because they're looking and they're saying that the testosterone enanthate did not cause the same amount of fat loss that the oxandrolone caused. And like you mentioned, at 3 months when they ran labs, they noticed that the liver values and the lipids were really skewed in the oxandrolone group. So they immediately switched them to nandrolone decanoate. And upon switching, there was a continued subcutaneous fat loss, but the visceral fat then seemed to increase. Why this could have been based on the androgenic properties of nandrolone decanoate or numerous other things. It's really hard to say. They don't go into that, but they did switch because it was risk management. And so people understand, in children or burn victims, when oxandrolone was used, it was used for 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off to kind of prevent that from occurring, because it would be used long term. So burn victim is typically used for 2 years straight, but they would do 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. That way the liver wouldn't get completely destroyed. So I think we definitely have a dosing problem here. And then we can talk about the thyroid stuff. So people also cite this too, right? They try to compare Anavar to T3. You probably
And
have some experience.
I'm not sure if this is where it comes from, but specifically, and I didn't see where they had gone over specifically the T3 and T4, but one of the notable outcomes was that there was a pretty significant decrease in the T3 resin uptake. And with this, it would either mean that there's probably lower activity levels or reduced thyroid hormone binding proteins. And as a result, you could potentially conclude that we would see an increase in T3 as a result. I think they stated that there was actually a reduction in T4, but based on this, you would typically see an increase in T3. And anybody that's manipulated the thyroid axis in a prep setting or has dealt with thyroid issues in the past, T3 is going to be that primary driver behind everybody's metabolism. So if you do have higher T3 levels, typically you will have a better metabolism, essentially. And then, but the minimal data that came out of this particular study in terms of the effects on the T3 resin uptake, I think this is probably where it's being pulled from, where if you take Anavar, then your thyroid goes on fire and you lose fat and you drop fat, and it's a miracle fat loss drug. I believe that's where that's coming from in the study.
Yep. So Anavar does, the science there's Anavar or Oxandrolone, it does reduce thyroid binding globulin. So that's similar to like sex hormone binding globulin. So, but it's a bound state. So it's basically binding up some of the T3. So it's inactive. So it reduces that and it increases thyroxine binding prealbumin. So it's then binding, it's binding up things that are stopping the thyroid from working. So that being said, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden it speeds your thyroid up to a different level. I've seen numerous labs of people on Oxandrolone before and after, and I don't ever see a difference in thyroid function.
I
So
haven't.
just because it's doing this in a test tube doesn't mean that it's really having much of an output or outcome in humans in real life. I also think some of the other issues, on a side note, there's probably a significant amount of people that are buying not real Oxandrolone on the black market, as it's relatively expensive per gram to manufacture and it's fragile. So a lot of times it is something totally useless, or sometimes it's something stronger like Winstrol, which could be disastrous for female.
Yes. And I think that's also one of the biggest issues with this study, especially when we have females that are potentially exploring this or going on Google and trying to find data to back up, or I guess justify their use of certain compounds, is that this doesn't study any females. Even in the title of the study, this is not necessarily the focus group that we're typically implementing any type of performance enhancing drugs on. And even, one of the biggest things is that's not necessarily going to be applicable to males or females in the bodybuilding community, because the dietary factors are so significant. And that's where a lot of this data is lacking, because nobody's going to have the adherence and the precision with their dietary compliance that an active competitor or like career bodybuilder would.
Yep.
And even in some of the negative effects that we see in terms of blood work after prolonged exposure, a lot of that can be mitigated through dietary tactics as well, which of course in our industry we utilize. But the average person that's wanting to dabble in PEDs or goes on Google and decides Anavar is going to be their, one-way ticket to a great body on a cruise, those things are not in place. So this data simply does not translate. And again, we are going to have much higher base testosterone levels in males if we are implementing some type of an oral compound. And we're going to be in a far leaner state before we would ever consider the use of Anavar.
Yeah. And most likely not on average 40 to 60 years of age, right? I'm almost 50, so I'm in the middle of that group, but I'm also not obese. And so the group also was not active, right? They were sedentary. There was no exercise used, and there was no dietary restriction whatsoever. So they just went about their daily lives. The only thing that was controlled for was the drug use. So you could say, someone could argue, well, but look how extremely well it worked. Now, if you actually look at the amount of fat loss that occurred, it was not that great. It was just greater than the placebo. What they didn't lose pounds of fat. And again, you go back to that, it caused enough side effects that they pulled the drug at 3 months.
And I would like to state as well, because so many people take this and expect to see that big reduction on the scale. When they were utilizing the Anavar, there was an increase in thigh muscle. That was one of the areas that were measured, and there was an actual increase. But once they brought in the Nandrolone, and again, that there was that time window where they made that switch. So I think there's some skewed information there, but it ended up with decreased muscle once they made that initial switch. But again, at face value, you would view this as, hey, you use the Anavar for fat loss and for more muscle. And it ends up looking like something that you should implement without question.
Yep. And if someone, just anecdotal experience working with this and with people, Anavar also seems to become less and less effective if testosterone levels go up to a certain point. So in a male athlete, if testosterone is really being used at greater than 500 or 600 milligrams, there's generally no need to incorporate something like Anavar. It's really not going to do much. Again, because of its class system, it's going to lose any of its additive effect there, right? So again, there would be better choices, mostly injectable things to use at that point. In a female, because you're generally not using testosterone, or if you are, you're using 3 milligrams, something very low, you would have, it would present more use, I think, in a female than it would in a male, right? I don't typically find Anavar to be, just because it's people believe it to be safe. Again, it's not one of the ones that I think is like a first call drug. I don't think it has this general application that should be used all the time. I think it's a very specific thing.
I feel like it's growing in popularity because, and again, I'm still confused. I don't know if it's like the Gemini laboratories, if it's still dosages. I'm very confused about the current state of legality in terms of being able to prescribe it or not. I know it is still being prescribed nationwide, but because of the availability, because it is being marketed, and anyone basically with an HRT clinic, most of these clinics are prescribing it. So I think that is definitely part of the appeal to the masses and people that are not necessarily trying to bodybuild, is that it's just readily available and it's not an injectable. And a lot of people just don't want to mess with needles. So if they feel like they can get more out of their current TRT by adding in an oral compound, it's no different than taking a regular supplement. And they don't necessarily have a full understanding of the potential issues that can arise as a result of taking it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm confused as well as the current state of a lot of the telemedicine or the HRT clinics. A lot of the people that I deal with, this is where they get their hormones from. And I see a ton of guys that are on some sort of modified TRT that are also written for Anavar, and they're written for Nandrolone. And it's kind of confusing to me why someone who's not a competitive athlete would need to be written for these drugs, right? If you look at the FDA uses for most of these drugs, like Nandrolone decanoate is currently specifically for is anemia. It's not to be written for, joint issues. Those aren't, not to say that they're not a valid, it's not a valid use. It's just not an FDA approved use for the drug. So I'm not really sure how these clinics get away with using this just because it's not illegal. It would be, to me, it's not much different than writing for halotestin for TRT. It doesn't make any sense. It's just not a drug you would typically give to a regular person.
I think the popularity of the off-label use is why we see so many of these compounds being used in unique contexts as well. And we touched on DECA previously. It doesn't make sense when you say it out loud. I'm having joint issues. I should take anabolic steroids. That wouldn't be your first course of action. And if you want to lose body fat, why would you go on something that's used to intentionally add size and prevent catabolism? Like it doesn't make sense. And typically when people aren't doing that background research and they want to get on some type of compound to expedite fat loss, they aren't typically with the mindset of, I really want to make sure that I'm eating a lot of protein and strength training and retaining my lean mass, and I can use this as a tool to retain strength and muscle during a steep deficit. They're just wanting to see the scale go down. And as you said earlier, the scale goes up, and the amount of frustration that leads to, especially for women that are taking this in hopes of drastic fat loss and drastic reduction in visceral fat, they don't get that satisfaction. It goes up. They don't really love it.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then to compound it, I think a lot of these clinics also are doing all the other diabetes drugs with it as well, which is even crazier to me. And you and I should do a video just on the GIP and the GLP
Or a
stuff.
whole series.
Yeah, a whole series on it. It just, to me, I'll just leave this here. I find it disturbing when I talk to clients and their supposed doctor, who has never actually seen them in person, has them on multiple drugs that are designed for diabetes and they're not diabetic. I have a big problem with that. And then on top of it, then they're given 4 different anabolic steroids to offset the damage that the GLP stuff has done. I just, like you said, it's perhaps people need to look at their whole lifestyle. I know this seems like such an easy way out, but we have not seen the long-term side effects from half of these drugs that these doctors are writing for. I mean, things like Anavar's been around since the 60s, Nandrolone decanoate's been around since the 50s. We're pretty well aware of what occurs there. I don't necessarily think they should be written for HRT at this moment, but in combination with things like metformin and Mounjaro, I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of where these places are all going with this stuff. It seems downright dangerous and profiteering to me.
And I think that's where some of the increase with Anavar being prescribed is coming from as well, because we see so many people that have drastic fat loss. I think we talked about, 8 to 10 pounds a week. Sometimes it's huge amounts of fat loss, and the dosages, of course, are not correct. They're suffering all these GI issues. They can't hold anything down. They're really not eating any food. So as a result, they don't like the physique that they have, because it's not coming from strength training and lifestyle changes that are truly sustainable. And there is a difference in just losing generalized weight versus losing body fat. Again, we know that in our community, but that's not necessarily something that is widely known. And to offset that, we are seeing Anavar being given out like candy. Like, oh, you want to build some muscle now. Never mind the fact that we put you on something that put you in a catabolic state and you've been losing every bit of mass that you have. Now we're just going to throw Anavar in the mix. Never mind your dietary compliance or even strength training. We will just give you anabolic steroids to offset the effects of the GLP-1.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, and it's not ever going to change. I'm dreaming, but I think if you talk to a doctor and they don't ask you about what you're eating, how you're sleeping, what your exercise is, and they're very willing to give you drugs for weight loss, to me, that's malpractice. I don't understand how that's even ethical. These guys sleep at night writing prescriptions for these things without understanding who they're even dealing with. And I see it all the time. It's disturbing. And I think then it also breeds a society where, and again, I see this in my own clients who they self-medicate, right? They have this toolbox full of drugs now that they were given by a doctor, and half of them are not the right drugs for them. And they'll just take things randomly because they were given this by a doctor. And I guess people just assume the doctor tells you to take it, it must be safe.
I had a client that we onboarded last week. We got his labs back and lipids were wrecked, liver enzymes were elevated. And I said, you taking anything besides the TRT? Nope. A couple days, we talk a little bit more. Turns out they had just finished up, I think it was 16 full weeks of Anavar, and they didn't really realize what they were taking. They said, well, he just gave me this along with something that was supposed to help with estrogen. And I said, what? Just something that was going to help with estrogen? Did you pull your labs? Did you see if it was necessary on your whopping 180 megs of tests a week? But they were just given Anavar. They didn't ask why. They were offered it. They took it gladly, but then they weren't able to relay that and understand the impact that it had on their labs, even though I was looking at it and clearly something had been utilized, but there was they weren't able to correlate the two at all.
Yeah. Well, even that, like you just said, with an AI, again, I'm the last person to be against an AI. I know the current trend right now is everyone wants to let the estrogen ride super high. But I think, again, with writing for an AI, the doctor needs to look at your labs first. Why is he just assuming, right? I see guys that need an AI at 150 milligrams, and I see people that need an AI at 1,000 milligrams. So it just depends. I don't think there's any blanket statement there with the prescription of these things. When it's needed, when it's not needed, it comes down to, like we talked about previously, about blood work, right? And maybe finding someone who actually understands how the human body works instead of a doctor online who clearly doesn't care. I'm not convinced that half of them even understand the stuff they're writing for. Right? If you're an internist, you've never studied Anavar in any setting, and you were not taught about it in school. You have no knowledge of it.
And a lot of the women that are wanting to get the Anavar, they'll have the very bare minimum required lab work performed in order to get that prescription. And while I would definitely advocate going the pharmaceutical route versus trying to search for something underground, especially as a female, in terms of fat loss, if you actually work with someone like you that can actually perform a thorough clinical analysis of your lab work, there's often underlying issues. If you're really struggling to lose body fat, obviously turning to anabolics is not going to be the first course of action or ideal, but there's almost always an underlying reason. You just have to find it. And even if Anavar was shown, and even in the study, as a very effective fat loss tool, there's still a reason why you're struggling. And it's almost always something that can either be corrected through diet and exercise or less invasive supplement protocols that don't necessarily call for something that's going to impact your hormonal profile, especially as a female.
Yep. Yeah.
And this study particularly is quoted by females that I'm like, well, you are not a hypogonadal, middle-aged, clinically obese male, so I wouldn't compare yourself to this.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. What it did to their subcutaneous fat is not quite the same as it's going to do to yours. And not to say that it doesn't work. I'll clarify that too. I'm not against Anavar. I'm not against using it. I just think that it's misused, and especially by females. I think it's used with the wrong intention. I think diet comes first, right? Exercise.
Always.
I think anabolics are an option, but I think it's farther down the road. And I think there's a level of experience. And if you don't know how to use them, then that would be the appropriate time to hire a coach like DJ if you're a female and you don't understand how these things work. before you go buy something, especially in the underground market, and you decide you're just going to take a bunch of pills because it's going to do something positive for you, right? I mean, how many disasters do you see all the time? People that decide to do this stuff.
Every single week.
Yep. Cool. Awesome. So I think next time maybe we could always look at there's that classic testosterone study too. That basically,
Want to do that one next?
Yeah, we could do that at 96, I think it was, where they don't exercise and yet they gain a bunch of muscle. So what does that tell us about testosterone? We could explore another one.
Maybe for next week. I like that.
Cool. Awesome, DJ. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Yep. Have a great day.
You too.